You know, at the time of the Northwest Forest Plan, we were practicing something called ecosystem management. And at that time, that was pretty cool. And we thought we were thinking big, obviously, you know, and after all, we started with the owl and we added old growth and then brought Gordy and the aquatic stuff in with the Gang of Four. And then we added social. So we thought we were taking a fairly holistic view of things. But, you know, in hindsight, 23 years go by, you realize that there are things that weren't on the table. Climate change wasn't a big issue. Interaction between the social and the ecological wasn't so clearly expressed. It was pretty much what's the effect of reducing the timber cut to protect the owl on the timber communities. And so it was a fairly narrow view. And so one of the things we tried to do in this chapter, which includes all the lead authors from the other chapters, is try to step back and look at some of the more holistic perspectives. It's a little bit of a synthesis of a synthesis, but also some summary. We know that the context has changed. Peter talked about a number of things, and not the least of which is the 2012 planning rule, which set the context for where we are now. And at the time of the Northwest Forest Plan, the planning rule then set the emphasis on viability analysis and species focus. That, in fact, Gordy and I were on a committee after the Northwest Forest Plan came out in search for some additional perspective that bring in more of an ecosystem perspective into the whole planning rule. That effort failed, but I think we finally got to the 2012 planning rule that went through. So this is really try to look at the bigger picture here, try to provide some integrated types of perspectives, cross-cutting themes. So as you saw in this picture earlier, we're really recognizing that the social component and the ecological component are interacting, and to really understand the future of these ecosystems, you need to understand the social dimension of it, not only the influence on the ecosystem, but just how we even think about nature and what's important across the spectrum of national forest values and uses. And so the interactions could be altered ecosystems in various ways, things that we directly do, like cutting down trees or building roads, or indirect things such as keeping disturbances out that were often invisible to us. And at the same time, the whole concept of ecosystem services is a new issue or a new way of looking at the forest, even though some folks would argue that the whole idea that the forest provides values besides timber has been around for a long time. So in this effort, we're really looking at trying to sort of create a framework to kind of as a wrap up in this final chapter. The emphasis on old growth was critical, of course, and drove a lot of the Northwest Forest Plan. A lot of the plan emphasis, if you think about it from a vegetation standpoint, and we go from the open forest here, open forest canopies to high canopy cover and small trees to large trees. The Northwest Forest Plan focused on closed old growth, mature forests, and conditions up in this area. And if we look at the species associated with this, the marbled murrelet was up here, the northern spotted owl is up here. The northern spotted owl in the southern part of its range actually has a broader amplitude in terms of the vegetation conditions it requires within its territories. And if you think of the aquatic habitat, as Gordy showed earlier, it's more than old growth. It also embraces early successional conditions and woodlands and open old growth and young forests and early successional non-forest vegetation. So the current effort is really trying to what we've done in the synthesis is try to show that that conservation in meeting the goals for the Northwest Forest Plan and National Forest is more than just this part of the spectrum. It's really the whole thing. The planning rule emphasizes the ecosystem scale, which is de-emphasizing focal species, although those focal species are still important, but it's sort of a matter of degree. It's a few focal species, and whatever that means. We had the experience with the Northwest Forest Plan and the Survey Managed program, where hundreds or even thousands of species were on the table became a burden for the agencies to deal with hundreds of species at an individual species level. So obviously the planning rule, 2012 planning rule, took a lesson from that and tried to find a different balance, recognizing though that the science says that ecosystem perspective alone does not ensure that you can protect any individual species. So there still needs to be a focal or a fine scale perspective. It means different approaches in the moist and dry forests. Certainly the Northwest Forest Plan recognized the difference between moist and dry forests, but in the dry forest, it tended to think that, well, really the goal there is to protect the dense multi-layered forest, which really developed from fire suppression. And so it really didn't recognize that the dry forests really have a completely different dynamic, and you might want to think about a broader range of objectives in dry forests than just the multi-story old forests. Ecosystem services, a new perspective, and collaboration, as we've heard from Lee, is sort of the very common throughout the region, efforts in various ways, but not necessarily a panacea or an easy course to some of the challenges that are faced in management. So some of the key findings, if you look across the whole chapter, or the whole synthesis, that is conserving species is challenging in the face of threats that transcend ownership boundaries. This includes climate change, this includes conditions on private lands, this includes a pattern of ownership, which is pretty strong to federal lands in the Cascades, but up in coastal areas is very strong to private lands. And there you're not gonna be able to balance or achieve a lot of those goals on the federal land alone. And so the implications of this is that we should need to temper expectations for what federal lands can do with regard to some endangered species or particular processes. And it emphasizes the need perhaps for more cross-boundary conservation. So these are challenges because they recognize that, again, what happens on the federal lands and what you can do with a chainsaw on federal forests is limited in terms of processes that might be related to invasive species moving in from across borders or climate change. Another key message from the overall effort is that managing for resilience requires active management. We've heard this from the aquatic side. We've heard this also on the terrestrial side. We've heard it on tribal perspectives. And it relates to this whole question of reserves, which we received a number of questions about reserves and what to do about reserves. And we have a number of areas in the synthesis where we talk about what reserves mean, what the science says about reserves. And it does say that reserves are critical from a conservation standpoint, but active management is often needed. So we should feel no compunction about going in, managing within LSRs or within managed riparian areas where you can demonstrate a good ecological goal. And there's lots of justification for that. We can't return ecosystems to the past, as I mentioned earlier. Talk about now managing for resilience rather than restoration. And what this means in the moist forests is variable density thinning, riparian management to restore heterogeneity, not just to get conifers back, but often to get shrubs and hardwoods back, which were critical components of streamside and near stream type of vegetation. And we talk about fire suppression, and we don't really say that we should stop fire suppression. Of course, that's totally unrealistic. We're going to need fire suppression as long as we have all these other values and limited land base. But fire suppression is still needed, certainly on the moist forest, to protect the remnant old forests that are left after decades of logging. In the dry forests, we talk about a landscape approach, taking this big picture. And that's something that is throughout the document and throughout a lot of the current literature. So no big surprise there. The challenge, of course, is what does that actually mean on the ground in particular places? And of course, thinning, prescribed fire, wildfire for ecological objectives are all part of that management approach for the dry forests and managing for resilience. So a word about reserves. And so I mentioned that the literature supports the need for active management and reserves, but there's actually a lack of demonstrated studies across the world, or certainly in the Pacific Northwest, on moving and adjusting reserve boundaries after disturbances. And most of these are talked about in terms of small reserves where there's a very particular habitat condition that gets blown down in a windstorm or gets burned up in a fire, then people think, well, where can we reproduce this habitat and find another place? For the larger reserves, as we showed earlier, a lot of these large LSRs have been able to absorb to a certain degree these fires, even though they're fairly large, but most of our large fires burn with a mosaic of severity. And so in this case, thinking about reserves more as a dynamic reserve for ecosystem dynamics is maybe a more realistic approach, particularly for the drier forest types where fire was a critical part of that. So that may lead us down the road of sort of reframing a little bit what the goals and objectives for the reserves are. They certainly include species like the spotted owl or marbled murrelets or other species that use dense multi-stored forests. But you've got, with the planning rule and with a greater awareness of climate change effects, you've got other perspectives, ecological objectives for these dry landscapes that you might consider sort of folding into sort of an updated vision of what a reserve means within the Northwest Forest Plain area. We found very little in the literature on climate change effects across the whole Northwest Forest Plain area, but what's there suggests that this backbone of reserves and a fair amount of land dedicated to ecological objectives, going from low elevations to high elevations, actually is a pretty good starting place for dealing with climate change. But there's a lot of details that need to be figured out, and individual species of changes and effects of climate change are still largely unknown. Forest restoration can be a win-win. This is to begin to kind of look at this connection between the social and ecological. Infrastructure and business has declined, as Susan demonstrated. Restoration activity for ecological objectives can help maintain the economic capacity of some communities. When we talk about restoration for early successional, or trying to create that, there's some good opportunities, I think, in the moist forests where it's more productive. In the plantations, where maybe creating some larger openings in plantations can provide some of that early seral condition, and provide an economic return, because a lot of the plantations now, 30 to 50 years old, and a moist forest can be pretty productive and make economic sense. The same perspective comes into the dry forest, but there's going to be greater economic challenges there to do that. And so subsidy of restoration is more likely to be needed in that type of environment than in the moist forests. And then trade-offs. If you look at any action or inaction that you could do on the national forests, there's going to be winners and losers. You know, oftentimes we have sort of a shifting baseline where, you know, on the dry forest now there's a lot of dense forests, and some people actually come to like that, and so efforts to restore or reduce fire risk actually may cause you know, some trade-offs there. And so we spend, in this chapter, we have a giant table of trade-offs, and we try to brainstorm for every action or inaction what the positives and negatives might be across a range of both species, ecosystem, socioeconomic kinds of values. And I think this is really important, and I think a lot of the public realizes there's probably trade-offs associated with different actions, but oftentimes those are not clearly articulated. But in some ways it gives managers, I think, more freedom to say, well, yeah, if we do this, we know we're going to have this effect, it's going to benefit these species, and it's going to have a negative effect on these species, but overall we think this is the way to go, at least in this particular place. So whether it be variable density thinning, which can accelerate large trees, but it reduces dead wood. Thinning a prescribed fire and dry forest can increase resilience, but reduce habitat for dense forest species. Roads, you all know the trade-offs associated with those, and social you know, values and accessibility of the forest, and suppression of wildfire, both positive and negative aspects. But I think there's opportunities to reveal those trade-offs and make them more apparent. Ecosystem services beyond timber benefit communities. This is, again, widely known, but we have more of a formal development of that knowledge here, how federal timber remains an important source for some communities, but in many other communities, recreation, tourism, non-timber forest products are very valuable. The water, carbon are promoted by old forests. You get some co-benefits of managing for old growth across the landscape. Old growth is a great place to store carbon. In many landscapes, it's also a great place to ameliorate climate effects because you have microclimate buffering that's been demonstrated in some studies. But I think work is still needed to apply the ecosystem concept in an operational context in the national forest setting. And there's language issues. I know from a little bit of work we've done in the Deschutes National Forest with ecosystem services. And so that's a terminology that sort of the wonky types like to use, but for a lot of folks just out on the ground, they think, well, what's an ecosystem service? Well, it's water, or it's a place to go hunting, or it's a cultural kind of place, my favorite place to do whatever, go pick huckleberries. We know that collaborative processes engage stakeholders to achieve ecological and social objectives. We know that a lot of the challenges we face are not the technical ones or biological ones, but the ones where social license is limiting. Collaboration can enhance trust, and that's well demonstrated. And as Lee mentioned, logging of old growth, at least in a clear-cutting sense, is definitely not supported anymore. And places are important, and these are more difficult perhaps to fold into an ecosystem service framework because cultural special places don't lend themselves so easily to this type of a framework. In the end, it's still about change and uncertainty. If we go back 24 years to the Northwest Forest Plan, we knew we needed adaptive management. We knew we needed monitoring because we knew things would change. We didn't just quite sure what those changes would be. Now we've seen the barred owl just coming on like gangbusters, changing the whole prognosis for the spotted owl. We've seen fire come on a lot more with the climate warming. We've seen social changes. And so it's very difficult, I think, for managers of the National Forest to say, well, we got this plan and it's going to produce X, Y, and Z, but maybe we're not so sure if we're going to get spotted owls, or maybe we're not so sure if we're going to get wildfires reduced in these places. And so acknowledging some of the uncertainty is really critical, but the way to get there is still the old tried and true and easy to say and difficult to do is adaptive management. And the adaptive management program within the Northwest Forest Plan didn't get very far down the road for various reasons, but we still think it's about the only way to go if we're going to learn anything. And there's formal adaptive management and there's informal adaptive management, and certainly the agencies have conducted a lot of informal adaptive management and learned a lot from the experience of implementing the plan, but there's still a need for a more formalized approach where you actually have some controls and some at least monitoring of different treatments across at a landscape scale. So here are some areas that might justify revisions or certainly rethinking of some parts of the plan. As Gordy mentioned at the beginning, what's working, or Al, what's working and what's not working. And so, the increased threat to the spotted owl from the barred owl, that's just huge because a lot of this started with the spotted owl and the concern over that species. But now we've got an invasive species that is very difficult to deal with and requires active management that may or may not be feasible economically and socially in terms of shooting barred owls. We've got decreased resilience of forest to fire and climate change. That's a big new dimension. We've got a broadening of the goals for the reserves and riparian areas to include ecological resilience. This comes both from the planning rule, the new planning rule, but also from the science that says that we really got to think about these systems even more holistically than we did at the time of the Northwest Forest Plan. Then we've got declines in vegetation diversity at landscape scales in some areas. And many areas, the forest is thickening up, and hey, from a forest lover standpoint, it looks pretty good from above. But there are these meadows, these other dimensions of biodiversity that are filling in. And they weren't really that recognized and emphasized in the Northwest Forest Plan, which focused again on the closed canopy old growth. And then finally, the federal land story. And that's a challenge. It's difficult to manage the federal lands. So how do you go cross boundary? That's a real tough one. but important. The potential for producing timber and creating vegetation diversity, the early seral issue. I think that's a potential win-win one that has both a social dimension as an ecological dimension to it. The declining forestry infrastructure and capacity for active management is a critical one in many areas, particularly in the drier forest side of things. And the recognition of the diversity of the human communities is important now, more important and more recognized now. And there's recommendations from the social scientists on what that might mean in terms of what a Forest Service manager could do in an amenity-based community versus a timber-based community. And then finally, reframing how the Forest Service sort of markets itself, for another better word of it, with ecosystem services. I mean, we constantly go around saying, well, it's water and wood and carbon and biodiversity and all of those things, but it's still a communication problem, and that's one challenge that I think we're struggling with. So those are some of the highlights of the integration chapter, and we hope that at least brings together a new kind of a framework, perhaps, for telling some of the stories that need to be told to the public from the manager side. We've kind of gone about as far as we can, sort of telling the science and research stories, and now it's your turn to turn that into a management perspective on our stories as well as other ones that we haven't even touched on.